On January 20th, 2021, Joe Biden was inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States. He came into office fresh off of a campaign centered on one thing: unity in the face of the aberrant and divisive presidency of Donald J. Trump.
And I don't look at this in terms of the way he does. Blue states and red states. They're all the United States. And now it's time to turn the page, as we've done throughout our history, to unite, to heal. I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify. Who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States.
He entered office with a trifecta in government, holding control of the House, Senate, and the White House. Though his majorities were slim, with his party controlling a House majority of only 5 seats, and a 50-50 tie in the Senate. President Biden was poised to enact his agenda of unity. Or so the nation thought. In the time since his inauguration just 2 months ago, Joe Biden and the Congressional Democrats have not embarked on any sort of unifying path. In fact, he has done quite the opposite, as the party has spent the last few months flexing their legislative muscles, moving towards ever more partisan and divisive legislation, and doing their best to flip the GOP minorities the political bird at every chance they get. Congressional Republicans cannot allow this brazen act of partisan division to go unchallenged, and must use the tools they have to fight back at every turn until Biden changes his ways. In this part, I will attempt to outline just a few examples of President Biden and the Democratic Party's divisive and partisan actions over the past few months. There are far more examples I could have included, such as Biden's nomination of David Chipman to the head of the ATF, his reference to a voting bill in Georgia as being, quote, Jim Crow on steroids, or the administration's continued insistence that bipartisan legislation need not actually include the other side at all. But in the interest of brevity, I have included the following as what I believe to be the most clear and damning instances of Biden and the Democrats using their newfound position of power to engage in national division. In March 2020, the nation ground to a halt economically, socially, and in many other ways as we shut down our economy and began to shelter in place in the face of COVID-19, a novel, highly infectious disease that to this day has killed over 500,000 Americans and infected countless more. Our economy suffered as we entered the darkest global economic downturn since the stock market crash in 1929. Millions were suffering, unemployed, and worried about whether they'd be able to feed their families. Over the next year, the federal government would pass more than $5 trillion of new spending to provide relief to those hurt by the pandemic. COVID-19 relief remained a hot-button issue into the 117th Congress, with President Biden and various other Democrats promising $2,000 checks in COVID relief after popular backlash surrounding the previous relief bill only providing $600 stimulus checks. The Democrats revealed their plan for COVID relief, totaling $1.9 trillion in relief, stimulus, and other spending. Republicans opposed this plan both due to its price tag, which they saw as being unnecessarily large, and various items in the bill that Republicans saw as, rather than being necessary for COVID relief, as being legislative pork, including redundant funding over top of unspent funds from the previous relief bills and a $15 minimum wage, something the Democrats have been pushing to pass for years without success. In response, a group of 10 Republican senators met with President Biden to negotiate a compromise. On February 1st, they proposed their own counteroffer to begin negotiations at $618 billion. The offer included Biden's proposed fundings for testing and vaccines, adds an additional $35 billion for the Provider Relief Fund, including funding for rural hospitals in danger of bankruptcy, and includes much of the original proposal at a lower price tag. However, the GOP response did not include funding for state and local governments or a $15 minimum wage, but did include expanded stimulus up to $1,000 and included $500 per adult or child dependents. However, rather than beginning negotiations, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer turned to budget reconciliation, to allow them to pass any legislation affecting spending revenue or the debt limit once per year with just 51 votes. This would not only allow them to pass the bill without facing a Republican filibuster, it would allow them to pass the bill without Republican input whatsoever, which is exactly what the Congressional Democrats did, as the bill passed both the House and Senate on party-line votes. Republican amendments were considered but were largely blocked, including amendments to remove the $15 minimum wage provision from the bill, as well as one which would prevent illegal immigrants from receiving stimulus checks. Those which did pass were largely symbolic votes. The only substantive changes made by the GOP were to provide extra grants for the restaurant and bar industry, as they have been some of the businesses most heavily impacted by the pandemic response. The $15 minimum wage provision was eventually ruled unlawful by the Senate parliamentarian, but even so, all but 8 Senate Democrats voted to overrule her, and there were threats that she may be removed if she ruled against it, though that never came to fruition. Many Democrats believe that what the majority did was reasonable, that the GOP bill was too low to be seriously considered. But there are 2 things wrong with this notion. Firstly, as shown above, Biden promised not to be that kind of president, yet in his first major bill, he is breaking that promise. This bodes poorly for any expectations that Biden would keep his word about being a president for all Americans. Secondly, the GOP bill was a starting point for negotiations. It's supposed to be low. It's what they would propose if Republicans were running the COVID relief bill alone. The point is that the 2 parties would negotiate to a compromise somewhere in the middle, which in this case would put the bill somewhere around $1 to $1.5 trillion. More than enough considering how much money is left unspent from previous bills. It would mean sacrificing the $15 minimum wage, but that is a small price to pay for a provision that divisive between the two parties. Not to mention the fact that it is completely unrelated to COVID relief in the first place, and has no place in a bill to that effect. Upon entering office, President Biden implemented a host of executive orders, many of which were aimed at reversing the changes the previous administration had implemented over the past 4 years. Among these were orders to halt all construction of the border wall, and the travel ban implemented under Executive Order 13780, reaffirming protections for DACA recipients, and others. One of Biden's more controversial executive orders on immigration included a moratorium on deportations during his first 100 days in office for all illegal migrants except those suspected of terrorism, espionage, or those who pose a threat to national security, though this provision was enjoined by a federal judge and is awaiting review in the courts. It also ended Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, an agreement with the Mexican government to return all asylum seekers who illegally crossed the US-Mexico border to Mexico and await their hearing dates there rather than being placed in detainment facilities or being released into the American interior. Biden has also introduced legislation to Congress to create a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants who enter the country on or before January 1, 2021. Those eligible would have to pass a background check, pay a series of taxes, as well as meeting other requirements over the course of 8 years. The bill also increases per-country caps on visas, raises the cap on diversity lottery visas, outlaws future travel bans based on national origin, provides $4 billion in aid to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to try and curb the flow of refugees, as well as setting up new refugee centers in Central America for citizens for those countries to apply for asylum in the United States. As a result of the new policy and rhetoric coming from the new administration, a humanitarian crisis has emerged at the southern border. Record numbers of children have been placed in holding facilities along the southern border in the largest wave of migrants crossing the border in 20 years. The number of migrants crossing the border has doubled ever since January 2021, and tripled among minors crossing the border since the end of 2020. Over 8,500 migrant children are currently being detained in HHS shelters, with 3,500 more in Border Patrol facilities designed to hold adults. The conditions are so overcrowded that social distancing guidelines have had to be revoked in these shelters, and there are reports of children being forced to sleep on the floor, unable to see the sun in their cells due to overcrowding. On March 22nd, things took another turn for the worse, as Border Patrol agents in the Rio Grande Valley were authorized to begin releasing adult migrants from custody without a court date in order to make room for the high numbers of unaccompanied minors crossing the border, who are required by law to be housed by Border Patrol until they can be released to the Department of Health and Human Services. Many of those released were not even asked for contact information, merely given identification papers to give to law enforcement if they were ever stopped. It's currently unclear how these people will be contacted to ensure that they go before an immigration judge. The administration has insisted that the crisis, which they refute even is a crisis, calling instead a quote, challenge, is not instigated by Biden policies, but instead by tropical storms, the Trump administration, and the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the data does not bear out this conclusion. The last tropical storm was seen on October 3, 2020, several months ago, and we would have seen mass migration well before now if that were the case. If it were the pandemic, we should have seen mass migrations occurring over the previous spring and summer, when the pandemic first spread and was at its worst. Instead, April 2020, the height of the pandemic, was the lowest level of border crossings for that year. As for the Trump administration, migrant flow slowed considerably under Trump due in part to the Remain in Mexico policy and other agreements made with Northern Triangle nations. It is only now, with a new president espousing pro-migrant rhetoric and removing many of the controls on migrant flow into the nation, that we see the increase in migrants coming over the southern border. What makes this situation all the worse is that Biden and many other high-profile members of the Democratic Party have condemned this exact sort of behavior under Trump and are now guilty of doing what they claim to oppose. Biden denounced the, quote, Trump-created humanitarian crisis at our border and putting, quote, kids in cages, but not only has created a humanitarian crisis at our border, he is also putting record numbers of kids in cages himself. Excuse me, not kids in cages, but facilities similar to jail, at least according to ABC News. Because as everybody knows, you can't have kids in cages if those record numbers of migrant children are just in facilities similar to jail. During his presidential run in 2020, Joe Biden promised to enact a sweeping gun reform agenda once elected. Now that he's been elected, he's begun trying to do just that. Following Biden's calls for further gun control legislation on the anniversary of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting in Parkland, Florida, House Democrats have passed 3 new pieces of gun control legislation that now await a vote in the Senate. The first 2 of these bills, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, or H.R. 8, and the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021, or H.R. 1446, both deal with expanding and strengthening background checks that gun purchasers must face before being able to own a weapon. H.R. 8 expands the requirement to perform background checks to all persons selling firearms, even if they are being sold in a private sale. Under this bill, all sales of any firearm must go through a licensed firearms importer, manufacturer, or dealer, who must run a background check on the purchaser before they may buy the weapon. H.R. 1446, on the other hand, closes what is colloquially referred to as the Charleston loophole, so called for its role in the 2016 Charleston, South Carolina church shooting, in which 9 black churchgoers were shot and killed by a white supremacist. The loophole in question refers to a provision in federal law in which any firearm sale will complete no later than 3 days after sale, even if a background check has not been completed. Under this bill, law enforcement instead has 10 days to complete any background check, after which the purchaser must petition the FBI to complete the investigation before they may receive their purchased firearm. These provisions have received much pushback from gun owners and those on the right, and for good reason. By requiring that all firearm sales must go through a licensed dealer, private sales of legally owned firearms become more expensive and time-consuming, due to the need now to find a dealer which offers this service, who may impose additional fees on the service, and the need to travel to that destination to access the service. H.R. 1446 is extension of the background check process, and the removal of any effective requirement for them to actually complete the sale within a given period of time would allow an unfriendly administration to simply slow-walk the process and ignore or deny petitions from the purchaser for them to actually complete the check, leading to a right delayed and ultimately denied. Even if we want to assume that every administration under this law will be angels and use it correctly, in the event that the background check system stops functioning for any reason, gun purchasers will be unable to receive their legally purchased firearms, and their Second Amendment rights would be violated. Another problem with these provisions is that they make the process of buying and selling firearms more difficult for the law-abiding citizen, while not making it any more difficult for criminals to obtain weapons, and as a result will have little effect in lowering the violent crime rate. Criminals will simply not comply with this new rule, instead buying weapons illegally without a background check or using straw buyers, an ongoing problem which this bill does nothing to address. In many cases as well, gun crimes are often committed by first-time offenders, which an expanded background check system wouldn't catch, such as the mass shootings in Parkland, Florida, or more recently in Boulder, Colorado. In addition, while the bill does not explicitly create a registry, it does record all firearm sales going to law-abiding citizens somewhere, which in effect may as well be the same thing, just with a few extra steps. Closing the private sale exemption is also divisive on its own merits, even if you could address the rights concerns surrounding these bills. The private sale exemption was carved out in 1993 as a provision in the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. The provision was formed as a compromise in order to pass the bill, which created the National Instant Background Check system in the first place, which otherwise would likely have been subjected to a Republican filibuster. Removing this compromise, which was made to pass stricter gun laws in the first place, especially in such a burdensome way, only goes to show that gun control advocates in Washington are acting in bad faith. It tells gun rights advocates that they should never compromise, because today's compromise is tomorrow's loophole. That all being said, if you do support moving the private sale exemption and want to create a universal background check system anyways, there is a way to do so without overly burdening law-abiding gun owners. Open up the NICS system for use by private individuals. A buyer would input their information into the system and receive a string of alphanumeric characters for use with the NICS system, which the seller would then input on their end to receive notice whether the buyer was legally allowed to purchase that weapon without needing to involve a dealer or pay a fee. Unfortunately, this system has its own problems, including not addressing straw purchasers, being unable to stop criminals from accessing black market firearms, and the fact that the NICS system is imperfect in itself due to poor reporting standards. But the way the bill in Washington is currently written is simply unworkable as it stands. It's unenforceable, it actively disincentivizes compliance with the law, and it will not lower violent crime. The solution I describe here instead incentivizes compliance by making it as easy as possible to comply. Gun owners, for the most part, do not want to sell weapons to people who shouldn't have them, and they will use the system if you make it available to them free of charge. Forcing them to involve the federal government and a licensed dealer on every sale, however, simply encourages non-compliance. In addition to these two laws, House Democrats have recently passed a third gun control bill, the Assault Weapons Ban of 2021. The bill currently has 35 Democratic co-sponsors in the Senate, including Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Majority Whip Dick Durbin, Assistant Majority Leader Patty Murray, and much of the remaining Democratic leadership. The bill would criminalize the possession, sale, import, manufacture, and transfer of any semi-automatic rifle, pistol, or shotgun with a detachable magazine and one of a list of primarily cosmetic features depending on what kind of gun it is. It also outlaws many firearms by name, including any variants of the AR rifle platform, one of the most commonly owned firearms in America, as well as outlawing possession, sale, manufacture, import, and transfer of any magazine capable of accepting more than 10 rounds. For reference, most modern sporting rifles use magazines with a standard capacity of 30 rounds, and many pistols use magazines with a standard capacity of 15 to 20 rounds. This bill would single-handedly outlaw most of the commonly used firearms in America today from ever being manufactured again. While the bill does allow you to keep any so-called assault weapons, a meaningless and divisive piece of political rhetoric in its own right, it must either be kept on your person or locked securely if it could be accessed by a person who isn't allowed to own one. Another instance of regulation that overtly burdens law-abiding citizens and disincentivizes compliance with the law. With the current 5-4 originalist textualist majority in the Supreme Court, it is likely that such legislation would be struck down as a violation of the Second Amendment, which makes this whole fruitless exercise seem all the more divisive to the right. Until recently, Xavier Becerra was a state-level official from California, serving first in Congress as a representative from California's 34th Congressional District from 1993 until 2017, and then as Attorney General of California. Given this, it was originally believed, or perhaps feared, that Becerra would be nominated as President Biden's pick to run the Department of Justice. However, on December 7, 2020, President-elect Biden announced that he would be nominated as Secretary of Health and Human Services. His nomination to that post was opposed by many groups, most vocally from those on the right, for a few not insignificant reasons. For one, Xavier Becerra has no experience of any sort in health or human services related work. Given that his nomination comes during the greatest public health crisis America has seen since World War I, this is already quite a major stumbling block for a Secretary of Health and Human Services to have. However, what he does have experience in is using the state for partisan political gain. During his tenure as California Attorney General, Becerra launched numerous lawsuits and prosecutions opposing religious liberty and defending indefensible laws. Becerra defended state laws mandating that churches had to provide coverage for abortion procedures in their health insurance plans. When the HHS found that mandate in violation of federal law, Becerra found that California would not comply with their decision. When asked if he would keep the division of the HHS, which had ruled against him, one which enforces religious liberty protections in civil rights law, Becerra refused to answer, the implications of which clear to all who listen. He defended a state law forcing pro-life pregnancy centers to advertise abortion procedures, which the Supreme Court found to be unconstitutional under the First Amendment. He used his office to defend countless gun control laws, many of which undoubtedly violate the Second Amendment, including a law he defended banning magazines of 10 or more rounds, which was declared unconstitutional by the Ninth Circuit. His most notable instance of using his office to enact partisan goals was in a little-known case by the name of California versus Little Sisters of the Poor. Under the Affordable Care Act, federal law mandates that employer-provided health insurance plans cover preventative health care, including contraception. After numerous Supreme Court cases, including Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores and Zubik versus Burwell, religious organizations were allowed to receive an exemption of the law and not required to provide coverage for contraception. The Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic organization dedicated to helping the elderly sick, applied for such an exemption in 2013, though did not receive one until 2017, after President Trump enacted an Executive Order 13798, making it easier to register a faith-based objection. California Attorney General Xavier Becerra, as well as numerous other state governors, sued the Trump administration to prevent the changes to the law and to stop the Little Sisters from receiving their exemption. The Little Sisters of the Poor spent the next 3 years in court until, in 2020, the United States Supreme Court decided Little Sisters of the Poor versus Pennsylvania, holding 7-2 that the new rules promulgated by the HHS were lawful and the Little Sisters could have their exemptions. Xavier Becerra is first and foremost a culture warrior. He has used his office as California Attorney General to defend unconstitutional laws, unlawfully prosecute churches, and sue the federal government to ensure that no one, not even nuns, could get away with not providing birth control to their employees, regardless of what their sincerely held religious beliefs or federal law had to say about it. He is supremely unqualified to be HHS Secretary during normal times, and yet Biden has decided that this man, this rank partisan, should be leading the nation's response to the worst pandemic we have seen since the Spanish flu. There are only two messages the right can take away from this appointment. One, the Biden administration would rather risk an increased death count from COVID-19 than miss an opportunity to dunk on the right. And two, whatever Biden's got planned for policy after COVID, he's not interested in unity in the slightest. On November 3, 2020, the United States held its quadrennial election for President of the United States. At the same time, many other seats were up for election, including a third of the Senate and the entirety of the House of Representatives. Most of these elections went off without too much issue, although they were delayed by the expansion of mail-in ballots in many states due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, one district's election was not so smooth. In Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, two challengers faced off to claim the open seat left by the retirement of Dave Loebsack, who had held the seat since his upset victory over Jim Leach in 2006. The Democrats ran Rita Hart, former Iowa senator and runner-up for lieutenant governor in 2018. The Republicans ran Mariannette Miller-Meeks, another former Iowa senator and perennial candidate in the 2nd District, having ran and lost to Loebsack in 2008, 2010, and 2014. The race was deemed too close to call for weeks, until on November 30th, Mariannette Miller-Meeks was certified as the winner by just 6 votes cast out of nearly 400,000 total, a difference of just 0.0001%. A bipartisan board of state-level officials voted unanimously to certify the results after multiple recounts, though Hart's campaign was signaling that she would challenge the certification. And challenge she did, as is her right under Iowa law. However, rather than challenging the certification in court, Rita Hart took a different approach. She challenged the certification with the U.S. House of Representatives. Under Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution and the Federal Contested Elections Act of 1969, the House may conduct an investigation into close elections and determine who will be seated as having won the election. This procedure is rarely used, last performed in 1985 after another Democrat, Frank McCloskey, successfully challenged and overturned Indiana's certification of Rick McIntyre as the winner of Indiana's 8th Congressional District on a party line vote, leading to every Republican House member marching out of the chamber in protest. Hart alleges that 22 legal ballots were not properly counted in the recounts, which would have changed the result from Meeks winning by 6 votes to Hart winning by 9. The House, which the Democrats control by a margin of just 5 seats, has agreed to take up Hart's complaint and to investigate. A panel was formed, consisting of 6 Democrats and just 3 Republicans. Meeks' campaign argues that Hart's challenge is faulty, that the ballots were not counted because they contained defects that ran contrary to Iowa election law, that Hart's claim that the ballots were legally cast lacks substantiation, and that Hart should have challenged the certification in court before challenging the election in the House. This process would provide a sticking point between the two parties at the best of times, especially given Hart's choice to challenge the election in Congress, a partisan body controlled by members of her own party, rather than going to state courts, who have jurisdiction over election law in the state of Iowa, or simply accepting the unanimous conclusion of the bipartisan Iowa Elections Board. However, in 2020, this challenge cuts deeper due to the way Donald Trump's election challenges were treated by Congressional Democrats. To be clear, Donald Trump's election claims were completely without merit, though I maintain that he had every right to challenge the results in court, just as Rita Hart does in her case. However, when Trump challenged the elections in courts, a perfectly legitimate and nonpartisan process for an aggrieved candidate to make use of, he was decried as a fascist trying to overturn the most secure and legitimate election of all time. Now that Rita Hart is trying to overturn the unanimous bipartisan decision of the Iowa Election Board to certify the vote after recounts across the district and based on ballots that the state election officials deemed to be defective, Suddenly, Democrats have changed their tune and are calling to examine the evidence carefully and wait to pass judgment until all the facts are in. Yes, Hart's challenge has more merit than Trump's claims, but it still remains meritless according to Iowa election officials, which I suspect that she knows this due to her bringing the case before the Democratic House rather than the disinterested Iowa courts in the first place. And the way the Democrats are entertaining this challenge without simply dismissing it outright would make it seem to me that they care more about winning another seat than doing what's right. A common counter to the argument I've laid out above is that Biden's policies here actually are bipartisan. They may not enjoy support from Republican senators, but they enjoy bipartisan support among the Republican base and the public at large. For example, Biden's COVID relief bill enjoyed 72% support among the general public, with 44% of Republicans in support. A new poll from The Hill shows 57% support for stricter gun control laws, including 36% of Republicans in support, and another which shows that 60% support Biden's 8-year path to citizenship, though no partisan breakdown is provided. However, there are a couple problems with using this new redefinition of bipartisanship to try and salvage Biden's promises. Firstly, issue polling is simply not a reliable tool to gauge public opinion simply due to the fact that most people aren't that knowledgeable about the issue and are easily suggestible. For example, a 2019 poll from the Associated Press shows that, when asked flat out if they supported Medicare for all, 56% said yes. Support rose to roughly 70% when people were told that it would guarantee healthcare as a right and would lower premiums. But when they were told that it could cause delays due to government involvement, that it could result in higher taxes, or that it would threaten the existing Medicare system, support fell as low as 26%. Polls have also shown that the labeling of policies can affect how much they are supported or opposed as well, the most famous example of which being existing polling differences between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act despite being different names for the same policies. People are not policy experts, nor are they even all that knowledgeable about many bills or political actions. If something sounds good, it will poll well, regardless of whether they might oppose the rest of the bill or if the bill has flaws. Something like Biden's COVID relief bill, which offers direct cash payments to basically every citizen, will poll quite well despite what people may actually think about the bill when they peek under the hood a little further, or when they see how the legislative sausage is made. There is also the issue that the stated preferences listed in polling often don't align with the preferences revealed by choices made at the ballot box. To use the example of gun control, polling tells us that 36% of Republicans will support stronger gun laws, but almost no Republicans in the House or Senate support stronger gun laws. In fact, the vast majority of them support looser gun laws and often campaign on that fact quite heavily. If there is such strong support for stronger gun laws within the Republican electorate, such a disparity theoretically should not exist. And while real life is messy, and the lineup of politicians to polling preferences will never be perfect, there should be more pro-gun control Republicans in Congress than the near-zero number we see now. In all likelihood, this outcome can be explained by, in addition to the knowledge problem discussed earlier, a mismatch between what voters say they want and what they actually do want. While polls may tell us that voters want X, it's hard to conclude that they really do if they only ever elect representatives who want the opposite. Many people as well, upon hearing the facts I've laid out above about President Biden's behavior, will be thinking about the last 4 years, and yes, they have a fair point. Donald Trump was an awful, divisive president during his time in office. He consistently broke expectations for how gauche, incompetent, and damaging a president could be to unity in the nation, and he should be condemned for all of it without equivocation. However, Donald Trump is not the standard we should hold our presidents to, regardless of political affiliation. Donald Trump is the floor for the modern president, not the ceiling, and we should expect all presidents who come after him to be better than that. Even if Trump were the standard, Joe Biden has spent the last 2 years on the campaign trail promising that he would be better than Trump, that he would bring unity and bipartisanship back to the country. Even if Trump is the standard for a normal president, and God help us all if he becomes that, we must hold President Biden to his own standards.